Good morning, everyone. Our topic for today is all about the role of Islam in the history of Filipino people by Cesar Adib Mahul. And these are the Philippine history reporters named Nancy Villenas, Kaylin Christine Cruz, Maria Angela Manayon, and Joan Berber. Facts demonstrate the Islamic influences from Borneo and Sulu were beginning to shed root in Luzon during the first half of the 16th century. Not long after, Islam was being strengthened in Mindanao from Sulu as well as from the Moluccas. The spread of Islam in the Malaysian archipelago is indeed a legitimate field of inquiry. But such a complex phenomenon must not be looked at as a mere spread of a few theological principles or religious beliefs and rituals, made possible by a handful of enthusiastic missionaries. The spread of Islam had represented an interplay of political, economic, psychological, and social causes and factors together with their ideological concomitants. Furthermore, the attractive characteristics of Islam as such, as well as its ability to satisfy new needs brought about by rapid economic changes due to the nature of the international trade at the time must also be considered. As you can see in this image, this is the role of Islam that can influence the Filipino people. If the Philippine Revolution is to be regarded not only as a movement of some Christian natives against Spanish rule, but of the Filipino people in their attempts of freedom, then there is no reason why the more than 300 years of struggle of the Muslim of the South against Spain and resistance against pressure from other Western powers cannot in the same light also be considered as part of the Filipino struggle for freedom. To put in the other way or another way, but parallel struggles can be considered as a movement of racially and ethnically related peoples in the archipelago that have helped to bring about the present situation where they find themselves trying to integrate into a single nation of Filipinas. Next slide is all about the first stage that represent the conception of Malaysia as a constellation of the sultanates and principalities exemplifying different stages in Islamization. It covers the period from the end of the 13th century to the end of the 15th century. So this stage portrays sultans, port kings, minor chieftains, and etc. that are participating in various degrees and intensities in the international trade, from the Red Sea to the China Sea, a trade that was under the control of Muslim traders, principally Arabs, Indians, and Persians. Many of the Malaysian ports serve as sources of articles of trade and as clearinghouses. A more direct participation of Sulu in this international trade can be traced to the arrival of Arab traders around the end of the 9th century of the beginning of the 10th century. Not long ago, after were ousted from the China trade in 878 during the Tang dynasty, after a prohibited policy of the Chinese against Arab and other Muslim traders, Kala in the Malay archipelago became for some time the last port of call for them. However, due to the persistent demand of Chinese products in Arab lands, either for domestic use or re-exportation to other lands in the Mediterranean, the Arab traders made efforts to get a Chinese product. It was then that they learned or discovered a new route starting from Borneo, then passing through Sulu, Palawan, Luzon, up to Formosa, and the south of the Tang dynasty, when the Muslim traders were allowed once more to frequent the ports of South China and the old route through the coast of Indochina began to utilize again. The new route was still used since the traders became acquainted either with new products or better sources of old products. However, it is clear that the use of this new or second route does not necessarily imply the Islamization of either Borneo or Sulu. It only suggests that the presence of Muslim traders in Sulu and therefore its more direct participation in the international trade. Sulu had started to become a clearinghouse for products, which its interpret sailors brought from the more outlying islands. The next slide is all about the important phases of the first stage. And these are the important phases. A. The coming to Sulu of Arab traders who performed missionary activities during the end of 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century. So at this time, there is evidence of trading colony in Sulu consisting at least of the transient Muslim traders. This is the base of the coming the Makdumin or Arabic singular Makdum. The first seeds of Islam were sowed by them. B. Increasing participation of Chinese traders in the Sulu trade. Traditional accounts of claim that Chinese Muslim traders had accompanied or competed with Arab traders. Eventually, competition and other factors made the Chinese displace Arab traders in the second route. And C. The coming of Sumatran Islamic influence and political institution during the end of the 14th century. So this phase is represented in the Sulu Torzilas by the coming of the Raha, Baginda, Ali with ministers and soldiers who arrived in Sulu and established a principality. D. The Sulu's official contacts with the Celestial Throne, 1417 to 1424, at least 3 tributes were sent. E. The establishment of the Sultanate in Sulu around the middle of the 15th century under the Sharif Abu Bakr, an Arab who had traveled extensively in Malaysia, in which the establishment of the Sultanate assumes that a great number of the coastal inhabitants of Sulu had become Muslims and therefore responsive to such as Islamic institution. It also shows their acquaintance with some Islamic jurisprudential elements, especially those which asserted the right of an Arab, more especially a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, to rule non-Arab Muslims. The Sharif Abu Bakr initiated attempts to convert the inhabitants of the interior of Sulu Buranuns and is believed to have been successful. The coastal peoples and those of the interior of Sulu became slowly integrated into a political community under central authority. Letter F. The coming of Islam to the Cotabato Basin and its consequent spread to the Lanao area during the end of 15th century. This is signified in the Mindanao Torsilas by the coming of the Sharif Muhammad Kabungsuan, an Arab Malay from Malaya, as well as a couple of Arab predecessors claimed to have been also sheriffs, and of which one returned to Sumatra. Letter G. The increases of Islamic influences in Sulu and Mindanao through greater maritime contacts with Malacca, Java, and Borneo, and the occasional visits of Muslim traders and missionaries from Arab in India land.
The next one is the second stage. The second stage represents the coming of Western European imperialism and colonialization during the 16th and 17th centuries to Malaysia. Also, it represents the destruction of the Arab and or Muslim monopoly of the international trade in Southeast Asia as a consequence of the coming of the Portuguese and the defeat of Arab fleets in Socotra 1507 to 1513 and etc. The Portuguese and the Spaniards came in 16th century not only to extend the position of their sovereigns but also spread Catholicism. In the same manner that they had the consciousness of coming from Christian lands and had a religious mission, the Muslim in Malaysia had a consciousness of their Islamic faith, of the integrity of Darul Islam. It would be a policy to maintain that on account of the different stages in Islamization in the various parts of Malaysia, there was no such conception. Actually, by this time, Islam was well rooted in Malacca, parts of Java, Brunei, and Sulu. From a very important point of view, Islam constituted not only a ideology that resisted and combated Western imperialism and colonialism and Christianity. Early Portuguese and Spanish authors had looked at their arrival in Malaysia as a continuance of the Crusader Wars between Christians and Muslims. It will be recalled that the fall of Malacca in 1511 was less than 2 decades after the fall of the Moorish kingdom in Granada. The Turkish menace to Europe had also increased after the conquest of Constantinople, while the coming of the Portuguese to Malaysia had followed their way in North Africa against the Muslims. So the following are the important phases of the second stage. The first one is the coming of the Portuguese and their disruption of the Muslim international trade. The fall of the Malacca to them in 1511, with the consequence that the central power of Malaysian Muslims shifted from Malacca to Aceh on northern Sumatra. Dutch commercial interests in Java and other parts of the East Indies in the 1590s. The second one is the coming of Christian religious and economic threat brought about a deliberate attempts at Islamic missionary activities on the uncommitted parts of Malaysia who were either Hindu, pagan, etc. This time, the missionary activities were initiated by Malaysians themselves, principally Javanese, accompanied occasionally by Arab zealots. Many Port of Kings became Muslims. Ambon 1515, Banjarmasin 1520, Mataram 1525, Bantam 1527, Sambas, Bima, and Makassar in 1600. So the next one is the rise of Brunei as a commercial power, its dynastic alliances with Sulu, and its greater participation in the trade of the Philippine archipelago. By the second half of the 16th century, Manila was already ruled by members of the Bornean aristocracy. This signified the beginning of the Islamization of the area around Manila Bay, beginnings of Bornean missionary activities in Batangas and other parts of the Philippines during the last quarter of the 16th century. Next one is the coming of Muslim missionaries and functionaries from Ternate to Mindanao. By the last quarter of the 16th century, there began a greater consolidation of the possessions of the Sulu Sultan from the northern eastern part of Borneo to parts of Zamboanga, including of islands of Tagigama, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi. At the same time, the consolidation of the sultanates of Maguindanao and Buayan is begun. Dynastic relations between them as well as with the Moluccas, principally Ternate. And the next one is fall of Manila as a Muslim principally in 1571. Spanish attacks on Brunei in 1578 and 1581 and first attack on Sulu in 1578. Treaty between the Sulu Sultan and Spaniards on June 14. Next one is conflicts between Spaniards and Maguindanaos in 1579, 1580, 96. Spanish attempts to colonize Mindanao. At this point, a study of Bertram's theory that the spread of Islam in Malaysia was accelerated by the coming of Western powers is imperative. The next one is Spanish expeditions on the Moluccas, 1982, 1585, 1593, and 1603. The expeditions can be interpreted not only as attempts to check Dutch ambitions in the area or to extend Spanish territories, but also to attempts to isolate Muslims in the Philippine archipelago and cut off the sources of human and material aid them to the Moluccas. Conversely, the temporary naturalization of the Maguindanaos was sought to facilitate the conquest of the Moluccas.
The third stage. The third stage represents the gradual fragmentation of the Malaysian Darul Islam under the spears of different colonial powers. It is a stage of great resistance and counterattacks against the West, which were mainly unsuccessful. The rise of Aceh as a great Muslim power failed to dislodge the Portuguese in Malacca. Javanese resistance against the Dutch commercial ambitions had weakened. Brunei's eclipse as a commercial power had begun. Brunei's missionary activities in Batangas and etc. had ceased. The fall of Luzon and the Visayas to the Spaniards and the destruction of Muslim pockets of resistance in Mindoro and other islands signifies that the northeast expansion of Islam to the furthest end of the Malaysian archipelago had been checked. Islam's furthest limit would be in its outposts in Sulu and in Mindanao. So here is the important phases of the third stage. Number 1, the contest for the control of Luzon and the Visayas between the Spaniards and the Muslims. This refers to at least two events. The first represents the 1589 attempts of alliance between the Brunei, Sulu, and Maguindanao sultanates with the disgruntled aristocracy of Manila and Tondo. To dislodge Spaniards from the Philippine archipelago, desperate attempts to get Japanese help did not materialize. Significance of the Magat Salamat conspiracy. The second event refers to the so-called piratical raids initiated by the Maguindanaos with Sulu and alternate help from 1599 to 1603. Blood compact between Maguindanaos under Guisan and Leyte Datos against Spain. Failure of the ultimate aim of such large-scale raids. Number 2 is the decline of the Sultanate of Buayan around 1619 in favor of the Maguindanao Sultanate under the redoubtable Sultan Dibatuan Kudirat, whose powers extended up to the Maranao regions. Cagayan de Oro became tributary to him in 1622 and Silangani in 1628. Kudirat's assumption of the title of Sultan after his death in 1671, the decline of the Maguindanao Sultanate began and slowly broke up into various minor sultanates. A Spanish presence in Mindanao frustrated the natural course of events for the gradual integration of various minor Muslim principalities under one centralized authority. Number 3, Spanish conquest of the Moluccas in 1606 cut off aid to the Muslims of the Philippines from the farther south. Further isolation of Muslims in the Philippines. Sulu and Maguindanao sought for Dutch alliance in 1614. Increase of Muslim raids in 1616, 1625, and etc. Number 4, the system of divide and rule of the Western colonial powers. Sultanates and principalities made to fight each other. In the Philippines, Christianized natives made to fight Muslims as well as to extend Spanish possessions. Spaniards persistently tried to foster dissensions between Buayan and Maguindanao. Nevertheless, dynastic or commercial rivalries between Western powers at home and abroad brought to Malaysia. This explains Dutch aid to Sulu, Maguindanao, and Ternate Muslims in their resistance against Spanish rule. The eventual frustration of Dutch ambitions in the Philippines also implied further dependence of Muslims in the Philippines on their own resources. Establishment of Spanish fort in Zamboanga in 1635, continued raids on Spanish-held territories by Muslim alliances. Number 5, the expeditions of Governor General Conquera to Mindanao in 1637 and Sulu in 1638. Lanao Expedition of 1639, the temporary character of Spanish victories. Fall of Julu on January 4, 1638. Transfer of Sultan's capital to Tawi-Tawi in 1639. The long rule of Sultan Muwalil Wasit I or Raja Bongsu from around 1614 to 1648. His alliances with Makassar in 1638, alliances with the Dutch in 1644. Treaty between Spain and Sulu on April 14, 1646. The evacuation of Zamboanga in 1662. The Sulu and Maguindanao Sultans as independent as before. Number 6, the inability of Sulu to expand or extract tribute from up north led it to look further westward in the island of Borneo for its tributary expansion. On account of intervention in Brunei's dynastic wars, the Sulu Sultan's territories in Borneo extended further west to the Kimanis River in North Borneo around 1690. By the end of the 17th century, during the reign of Sahabuddin the power of the Sulu Sultan extended from parts of Zamboanga to the Kimanis River in the northern part of the islands of Borneo. The fourth stage. The fourth stage refers to the attempts of the Zulus to regain part of their former glory during the 18th century and early 19th century. Around 1700s, there were dynastic quarrels between Sulu and Maguindanao, and the Zulus tried to exercise some domination over the Cotabato and Zamboanga regions. During this state, there were strong attempts on the part of the Muslim sultanates to recapture their ancient commercial glory. The English tried to have a foothold in Sulu territory to exercise greater hold on their China trade. A few salient events are listed below. So these are the important phases of the fourth stage. The first one is a modest resumption of Sulu trade with China initiated during the reign of the Sultan Sahabuddin around 1700s. Number 2, attempts to Badar-ud-Din the First for peaceful commercial relations with Manila. Treaty of December 19, 1726. The third is the so-called piratical raids during this time and earlier can be interpreted as a source of income to make up for the loss of participation in the international trade and the former trade with China. The raids were also meant to weaken Spanish resources which were used to subject the Muslims. Of importance too was that they were also intended to intimidate Christian natives used by Spaniards to conquer the Muslims. Muslim attack on Palawan, the Calamianes, and etc. Under Datus Abdullah or Nasar-ud-Din in the 730s, the significance of this attack is that they partially satisfied the expectations of the Zulus for strong leadership during a time when there was a dynastic rivalry for the Sultanate. Therefore, the difference of character and rule of the two brothers Azim-ud-Din I and Muiz-ud-Din, the former believed that he could keep his throne and help Sulu with friendly relations with Spain and by the granting of concessions to Spaniards, accepting the fact of the meager resources of the Sulu and their relative isolation from other Muslims principalities now under the domination of other Western powers. Azimuddin I believed that Sulu's progress could be the result of the strengthening of the institution of the Sultanate and other Islamic institutions, together with commercial and political relations with Spain and other lands. His attempts at commercial relations with China, his tribute to China in 1743, Muiz-ud-Din, the Datu Bantilan, on the other hand, believed that such independence could be maintained by the closer relations with English who could be considered as source of material aid against persistent Spanish aims at domination. He even toyed with the idea of contacting the Ottoman Sultan at Istanbul for possible aid to help maintain Sulu's independence. Bantilan's conception of Darul Islam, though relatively of place at that time, reflects his Islamic consciousness. In 1754, he almost asked for Chinese protection. Muiz-ud-Din reign witnessed an increase of moral depredation on the Bicol regions, Mindoro, the Manila areas, and etc. Last is number 5, relative peaceful relations between Sulu and Spain from the reign of Sultan Muhammad Israel to Sultan Sharifuddin, modest commercial prosperity for Sulu.
The next one is the decline of the sultanates. The decline already manifested earlier becomes more manifestly rapid by the middle of the 19th century onwards. Badr-ud-Din's earlier failure to capture Zamboanga in 1719, not long after its refortification by the Spaniards, revealed Sulu's weaknesses. Badr-ud-Din's alliance with the Maguindanao and negotiation to patch divisive elements between Zulus and Magindanaos around 1720s to make another try of Zamboanga was not very effective. Greater pressures from Spaniards to assert their sovereignty in Sulu. Sulu was then being pushed into a vortex conflicting and rival ambition of Western powers, which spelled doom to independent existence, a small principality that has ceased to have place in rapidly changing world conditions. A few of the significant events are as follows. The first one is the commercial ambitions of the English exemplified in the cessions of Balambagan in the first cession of the North Borneo territories of the Sulu Sultan to them in 1760s. Destruction of Balambagan in 1775 by the Zulus under the leadership of the Royal Dato Teteng. French commercial ambition shown by their desire to purchase the island of Basilan from Sultan Lalun in 1842 to 1862, in 1845 and 1844. The second one is the Spanish use of steam war vessels in 1848 enabled them to gradually gain mastery of the Sulu Sea. The destruction of the power of the Balangigis Tamals and forcible deportation of survivors in 1848 by the Spaniards. The third one is Spanish expedition to Davao in 1848. Uyangorin versus the Sulu Dato Bago. Next one is the visit of James Brooke, the British Consul General at Borneo and Governor of Labuan to Sulu in 1849. The inking of the political and commercial pact between Great Britain and Sulu revealed the attempts of Sulu to play one European power against another. Fear of rival Western powers in Sulu alarmed the Spaniards, who know the desire more than ever to subjugate Sulu. The next one is Spanish reaction to the ambition British, French as well the persistence of piratical raids culminated in the Spanish expeditions against Sulu and the capture of Hulu in 1851 under the leadership of Governor General Urbistondo. Treaty with the Zulus on April 30, 1851. Zulus interpreted the treaty as one of the friendly relations, while Spaniards considered in Zulus acceptance and Spanish sovereignty. The next one is the Spanish expeditions of 1876 and capture of Hulu. Establishments of permanent outposts in Hulu. The January 1878 cession of Sulu's North Borneo possession to a British company by the Sulu Sultan. Treaty of July 26, 1878 with the Spaniards, extension of Spanish power to the other islands. Spanish intervention in Sulu affairs, even in dynastical quarrel, rule of Jamal ul Azam in 1862 and 1881. The next one is the rise of Juramentades. Significance of such an event in that organized resistance under the Sultan had failed. Responsibility for the integrity of Dar-ul Islam had become an individual one. The next one is change of official Spanish policy, the transformation of the Muslim in the Philippine archipelago into loyal Spanish rather than converting into a Catholicism. The next one is the 1885 Protocol. It was between Great Britain, Spain, Germany agreed that Sulu belonged to the Spanish sphere of sovereignty. The next one is the 1891 Whaler Campaign in Cotabato. It was in 1895 Blanco's Campaign in Lanao, the Juramentado institution among in the Maguindanao.
So for continuation about the topic, next is all about the Philippine Revolution and the American occupation. So first, I'm going to give you an idea. The Moro is a word that derived from the Spanish Mor, which is a term of Muslim people who live in the southern Philippines, an area that includes Mindanao, Hulu, and the neighboring Sulu archipelago. So Moro Rebellion was an armed conflict between the Muslim people and the U.S. military during Philippine-American War. So the Moro population of the southern Philippines resisted both Spanish and the United States colonialization. The following of the American occupation and of the northern Philippines during 1899, American forces took control over the Spanish government in the Hulu in Zamboanga, where the Moro fought for religious rather than the political reasons, and their actions were unconnected with those of the Filipino revolutionaries who conducted the Philippine-American War. So let's start. So first, there's a topic that leaders of the revolution consider of Muslims of the South as Filipino, bound with them by racial ties, ancient historical relations, and geographical propinquity. Propinquity were the manifesto of the Hong Kong junta in 1893 declared that the Filipinos were made to fight in the Moros in Mindanao and Hulu, who reality are brothers like us fighting under independence. Where Aguinaldo's message to the Congress on January 1, 1899 proposed that the government be empowered to negotiate with the Moro of Hulu and Mindanao for the purpose of establishing national solidarity upon the basis of the real federation with absolute respect for their beliefs and tradition. So next, the Battle Treaty with Hulu Sultan in 1899. You can see in the picture that given. So let's see. The Treaty of Paris between Spain and the United States formally transferred sovereignty over the Philippines Islands for $20 million. Peace treaty between Sultan Jamalul Kiram III and the U.S. Brigadier General John C. Bates is signed, recognize the American sovereignty over the entire Sulu archipelago and Mindanao on 1903. So this is the map. While the spread of Islam in Southeast Asia on 13th and 14th century, here, if you can see the world map, and 15th century color green, and 16th century for red, and the yellow for 17th and 18th century. So Islam start to spread in Philippines on 16th century, where Philippines or Mindanao is color red. So next, see the defeat of sporadic rising against the American occupation and the futility of the Battle of Budbaju on 1906 and Budbadsak on 1913. So, The the picture on the left side, which is showed the aftermath of the First Battle of Badyo, aka the Moro Crater Massacre between U.S. Army that against the Moros in 1906 during Moro Rebellion in the southern Philippines. A higher percentage of Moros died that incident and now considered massacre. If you can see, this is the military army. Wait. The military army take pictures to the Moros victim of that battle. And at the right side picture, three Moros rebels being hanged in Hulu on July 21, 1911. This is the three Moro rebel that hang. So now, next topic is letter D. Sultan Jamal-ul-Kiram's formal abdication of political power in 1915, Carpenter's Agreement, Muslim representation in the Philippine government, where on March 22, 1915, there is a memorandum Carpenter Agreement between Frank Carpenter and the Sultan of Sulu, Haji Muhammad Yaul Kiram of Mindanao. While next topic is the role of the Moro residents against the Japanese occupation. The two pictures show the situation of the Filipino and Muslim during the Japanese era, where for three years the Philippines was in the hands of the Japanese, who set up a military administration. And next is letter F, the independence of the Philippines on July 4, 1946, all Filipino Muslim with rights and citizenship. July 4, 1946, the Philippines gained independence from the U.S., where the where on July 4, 1946, used to be considered an important national history in the Philippines. All Filipinos, Muslim with rights of citizenship, their responsibility in building the national community, and the responsibility, honor of others towards them, and the increase of secularization of the Philippine society. And then, for the Muslim legacy, you can see that just like other Muslim nations in Southeast Asia, national identity of the Philippine Muslim was shaped by Islam and further developed in the course of the heroic struggle against Western colonialism. The Philippine Muslims won a district honor as Moro, an identity put toward by the aggressors after the Moors of Spain, and they were called Moro only on account to the Islamic ideology and their culture being similar to more in Spain. For addition, since then, the Muslim in this country or in our country have been identified in Southeast Asia and across the Muslim world as the Bangsamoro people, which is identity is officially recognized by the Organization of Islam and Islamic countries and enshrined in the Muslim Organic Act of 1989. So, next, the Muslims practice Islamic calligraphy to represent God and depicting God in any other form. So, in my own opinion, in our world, we have a different language, different religions, different strategies and practices in our government. So, even we experience that, just don't forget the word respect and the human rights of every citizen in our country, even if they are here in inside or outside of our country. So let's respect our own beliefs, traditions, and cultures and mindsets from our own ancestors. So that's all. Thank you for listening.